This is Chapter 10, Lecture number 1, and we're going to introduce the concept called the mole. So what do we mean by a mole? Well, a mole is a unit that represents a quantity. So how do we measure matter? Well, we can count things. So we can say there's 12 eggs in a carton. We can have 12 roses in a dozen. We can say the mass of something. We can buy malted milk balls by the pound. We can buy gold by the ounce. And we can measure by volume. We can say we buy gasoline by the gallon. We measure cough medicine by the tablespoon. So if you think of a dozen apples, we can have a dozen apples, which means we have 12. We can say that the dozen apples weigh 2 kilograms, which is mass. Or we can say in a dozen apples we have 0.2 bushels. Not that we have to know what a bushel is. So now, how do we convert from one measurement to another? And this is where the proportion comes from. Sometimes we can do it in our head, and sometimes we have to set up the work. So let's try these in our head. If I have a bushel of apples, well, I know that 0.2 bushels is 1 dozen. So if I have 1 bushel, I have 5 dozen apples. 5 times 0.2. If I have 5 dozen apples, then 5 times 12 in a dozen, I have 60 apples. And that's the math we're going to be doing, which we could have just set up a proportion and solved it mathematically. If I have half a dozen apples, then I have 1.0 kilograms of apples. If I have 4 kilograms of apples, I have 2 dozen. If I have 2 dozen, then I must have 0.40 bushels. This picture just shows different ways of counting. And now chemistry and counting. Our calculations center around a measuring unit that we call a mole. The mole can be related to the number of particles, the mass, or the volume. So just like a dozen was related to apples. The crazy thing is, what does a mole equal? Just as a dozen represents 12 objects, a mole represents a certain number of objects. So what if I said a mole was equal to 602? I think we could grasp that. So if I had a mole of books, I would have 602 books. If I have a mole of planets, I would have 602 planets. The mole just tells you how many. It's what you have how many of that you have to figure out. If I have a mole of bridges, I have 602 bridges. Just like if I had a dozen bridges, I would have 12. But a mole does not equal 602. But what if I said a mole is equal to 602,000? So if I had a mole of marbles, I would have 602,000 marbles. Just like if I had a dozen marbles, I would have 12. But a mole is not 602,000 either. A mole is 602,000 billion billion. So if I have a mole of trees, I have 602,000 billion trees. The reason the mole is such a big number is because the things we're measuring are so extremely small. 602,000 billion, written as a decimal, would be 6.02 times 10 to the 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21, 22, 23. 6.02 times 10 to the 23, which is this number right here. Now, what are we measuring that's so small? This is crucial that you understand this. For elements, the basic unit is the atom. For diatomic elements, since they're covalently bonded, it is the molecule. For molecular compounds, two nonmetals bonded together, it is also a molecule. If you are ionic, the representative particle, the basic unit for a metal and a nonmetal, is the formula unit. So that is it for today, and we will see you tomorrow in class.